Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Hi, welcome to Tsundoku, the podcast for anyone who finds the highlight of a holiday is a good browse in the airport bookshop. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Annie Hastwell, and I know exactly what you mean. That's me. I stay in the airport bookshop for so long, the staff start to look at me suspiciously. But airport bookshops are a breed apart. They're so enticing.
Now, you've been travelling. Have you picked anything up lately, Annie, or what are you reading?
Well, actually, I picked up my phone. It was very handy on planes, reading on the phone. And I've been reading John Wyndham's Midwich Cuckoos, also watched the current streaming series, which is pretty horrific, and really interested to see how the modern series handled something that was written in the 60s. Fascinating topic. And I'm going to be chatting about John Wyndham with another John Wyndham aficionado in an upcoming Tsundoku. And I've also been reading 2 memoirs about Paris, written by Jane Tuttle. Amazing book. She had a huge experience, but she's also got a wonderful approach to an understanding of Paris. And she's in Queenscliff. I'm heading off this week on a bit of a tour of Victoria, and I'm going to pop into Queenscliff and have a chat to her.
Gee, sitting in one beautiful location and discussing another, that's
exactly.
not going to be too hard to handle, is it, Annie?
And what about you, Sarah? What are you reading at the moment?
Well, I've just come out of a reading slump. I was talking recently about no books are really grabbing me and really holding me, but I've had a few that have done so lately. I've just finished a book called Girlfriend in a Coma by a writer called Douglas Coupland. It's a bit of a dystopian, otherworldly thing. It's phenomenal, and it's one that I read about 20 years ago, and I sat and read it from start to finish. I didn't sort of come up for breath. And so I revisited to see if it held up, and I really did enjoy reading it again. But what kick-started the break out of my slump is the book I'm talking about today. It was a crime thriller, and it was what I like to call my palate cleanser. When I'm finding I'm getting stuck with reading, that's what I go to, is a quick page-turning crime book, and I love it. It just refreshes everything.
And also coming up, we'll be looking at comfort reading and a very well-known author that Tsundoku's Cath turns to for stress relief in spite of the deathly subject matter.
A woman who was born at the end of the 19th century, started writing maybe about 100 years ago. I still have a rotating collection of hers by the bed, and if I need to calm down before I go to sleep, I pick up, and it almost doesn't matter which one.
You know this author, you really do. But now to a more current crime thriller.
It's called The Unbelieved. It's written by Vikki Petraitis, and she is best known for true crime writing. So she's looked into and investigated all different crimes from across Australia. She is an Australian writer. She's talked about the Phillip Island murders, the Frankston murders. She's looked into the Russell Street bombing, sex crimes, pedophilia. You know, she's got really gritty and dealt with some very uncomfortable subject matters in real time. So she's flipped the script. She's created a town. She's created an amazing protagonist, Antigone Pollard, who is a senior detective who doesn't take no for an answer, sticks up for herself, fights a good fight, and basically turns up and realises that there is a spate of date rapes happening in a town that she arrives, and takes it upon herself to find out everything about it and find the perpetrators. I caught up with Vikki and I talked to her about what it was like flipping her mind from this true crime world into the world of fiction.
In a lot of ways, it made it super easy because in my head, I had 30 years of research and 30 years of interviewing victims and survivors and victims' families and police, and all of that was sitting in my head. As a woman, I've spent 57 years, take out the baby years, living in a society that is largely a patriarchal society, and having all of those experiences that every woman has in the workplace, in my regular job, everything that I've ever experienced just seeped into this novel. And I think that's why it's resonating with women so much, is because everyone's going, yep, I know someone like that.
It seems very timely. I think you'd certainly read the pulse of what people are ready to talk about, wanting to talk about, not to shy away anymore and hide these things. I really appreciated reading a crime fiction about such horrors inflicted on women, written by a woman, and I felt different about it. Have you got that kind of feedback?
When Emily Webb from Australian True Crime launched it, she said, I feel like it's a love letter to victims, and it's not saying that women are victims and then broken, the end. It's saying women might be victimized, but they get back up again, because this is what women do. And it's about women supporting other women. We get this, I don't know, patriarchal narrative where, you know, women are bitches or women don't support. And every time you say, oh, actually, I find women supportive, there's always that one voice, oh, no, I had an awful boss once. I wanted to write women's experiences. And to me, women are massively supportive. Even when you're tough, I wanted to write how hard it can sometimes be to not only do your job, but to do your job and battle a negative male boss. Oh my goodness, it just makes it twice as hard. I think that needs to be spoken out loud. This whole book is about voice. It's about when the law doesn't work and when these systems don't work, women will overstep them and they'll just stand up and go, listen to my story. And I think The Unbelieved gives voice to all of that, hopefully.
Your protagonist, the chief detective, Antigone, she's a force. I loved her. I'd rather you describe her. Tell me what you see in her.
When you start to make people up, this is what I've never had to do because I write true crime. The people already exist. You kind of have to think about what your standards for her are. And the things that I wanted for Antigone Pollard as a character, I made the decision for my book that she would not be pummeled and beaten. And, you know, so many books where you have a female protagonist and you think, yay, that's great. But then she's a punching bag for the entire book. I acknowledge that that works well in other books and for other writers, it's a great decision. But for me, it's like my protagonist will not be, she's not a punching bag. So that was like number one rule. No one's going to hurt her. And if they try to, she's going to be very, very able to protect herself. And where she can't, I gave her a wolf-like dog, Waffles, who was able to leap in and help. I wanted to create a character who was fearless. And this is totally based on a book that I wrote on a retired cop. He said, I just never felt fear. And I wondered, the minute he said it, I'm just, my mind is ticking over thinking, what if we had a female character who just didn't feel fear, who just confronted an uncomfortable situation and said, oh, I'd rather not be doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Whether it's her boss, whether it's, you know, someone in the community who's not nice, or whether it's someone who's actually threatening her. Also, unencumbered and to have no pull on her time. This is weirdly common. Like the female protagonist will have headaches. Like Antigone's not going to have a headache. And we have these male detectives and we have these male heroes like a Jack Reacher or a Hercule Poirot. They don't have pulls on their time. They just get on with stuff. And I know that most women have those, you know, things pulling on their time. But I just wanted a character that did not exist for her, that she would have to go home to feed the dog, but she loved that. The dog was very much a part of her little family, but that her time was her own and her decisions were her own and they didn't impact on anyone else. And I thought, we love that in our male heroes, but it's a bit less common in a female hero that they're going home to a family or to cook dinner. I'm like, I don't want that for her. I just want her to be completely independent.
I like that. And every woman was within her power, each character, in terms of, you know, Nan turned up and sat around and they talked about a case. They talked about what was going on and she was curious. And I love that, not burying an older character just because of their age. It felt like everybody had their space.
It's real, isn't it? And I didn't want the Nan to ever say to Antigone, "Oh, I haven't seen you for a while." So it's just this reversal of this guilt trip, or this, that she's there because she wants to be there, because Nan is a decent person. Nan is a farmer, and she can step in and take on Antigone. And so there's every reason for these women to get along, and they're not a burden. People are really loving this real life kind of atmosphere that I've created, that's totally from my world,
I think it's clear that you understand the procedure of crime and the procedure of law. The reality of the disappointments that we have in the system, and particularly that women who have been abused are trying to get through the system and get justice. Even though you have your knowledge and your research based in crime, how uncomfortable does it make you feel sometimes to have to step into this and write it?
I've been stepping into this ever since I started writing. So in 1999, I wrote a book called Rockspider, and I went and with the head of the Victoria Police Child Exploitation Squad, Chris O'Connor. At the time, I didn't want to write books about pedophiles, but when I spoke to Chris about the way that they targeted children, and the way that 94% of all children are targeted by people that they know, not by strangers. And I was a mother and a teacher. I had a small child back then. And I'm thinking, I should know this. People should know this. But I'm always motivated by, oh my God, this should be bigger than what it is. I have to tell this story. So I'm able, I think, to put any kind of personal discomfort aside. Like my character, I have to be brave. I met a woman who ended up being a forensic psychologist and a professor, and she said to me, I specialised in sex offenders because of reading Rockspider. And I said to her, wow, I wrote that book and kept thinking, if this helps one person, it'll be worth it. And she said, well, I've trained thousands of people over my career as a lecturer and working in this field, and they've trained thousands. So if it's any consolation, this is the result of your work. And I'm like, whoa, it's mind-blowing, because it's not a nice topic to write about. Of course it's not. But it's an important topic, and important trumps nice every single time.
Well, we have seen in recent times, keeping nice doesn't get us anywhere.
Doesn't.
What kind of self-care do you undertake? Because it is a dark world to live in.
Yeah, I don't really give myself space from this. I pretty much work 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. And I think what happens is, when you write about something, within that writing process, I think you're processing it. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this play out with people that I've interviewed, that in talking about abuse and in describing what's happened and reframing blame, and them going, oh, wow, yeah, I couldn't have done anything. You can see this play out. Mm-hmm. And I think that because I write about it, you're not just writing events in time order, this happened, then this happened. What you're doing is you're saying, this happened, and this is what it meant. This is the ripple effect. This is how we can use it to learn and grow. And what you're doing is that you're, as a writer, you're unfolding that process of understanding. And maybe that's why I'm able to do this work with immunity.
Something that I love in particularly Australian crime is how powerful the landscape is in the story. What made you choose the space that The Unbelieved is set in?
I feel like, for me, small country town was a way of closing in your setting. So whether you're setting it on a mountaintop or whether you're setting it on a submarine, it's a way of closing in the list of suspects. Because when you think about it, if Antigone's drink is spiked in Melbourne and she goes out the door, well, then someone hops on a tram and they're off. But in a country town, there could be one road in and one road out, and you've got this containment that I think really works well for a writer. And I know we have a lot of kind of inland farms. I wanted a coast. And my first book, The Phillip Island Murder, is on Phillip Island, naturally. and it's not based on Phillip Island at all, but it's seeing these coastal landscapes and this rugged beauty, but it's also scary because it's dangerous. And I also wanted that metaphor of Deception Bay, that the surface is calm, but beneath the surface is ragged and dangerous. And I wanted that to be the metaphor for the town. And so that inventing Deception Bay really worked.
In the Unbelieved, you know quite a lot about particular drugs and their interactions with people, the date rape drugs and all these things. Is this knowledge stuff that you've gained over years?
Absolutely. And it was funny because one reviewer said, oh, Petraitis has made a mistake with the drugs, not very thorough research. And I thought, okay, well, this is actually based on a real case. I interviewed a forensic pathologist. I interviewed the detectives that interviewed, and I cite the case, not my name, in the book when the doctor looks up and she said, oh, yes, there's precedent for this drug to interact with this other drug. And it's exactly based on real life. So I mean, not that authors don't really answer, to criticism, but every now and again, you're just sort of sitting there going, if you read my other books, you'd see that this is actually these exact drugs are used, and the exact drugs that were found to not play nicely together and to cause death that was unexplained. A lot of it's based on real life because it's all just sitting in my brain.
Is there stuff you've got to be a bit careful about that you sort of had to go, oh, that's getting a bit too close to some real stories that I know, in terms of respect for victims and things like that? Was there points where you pulled yourself back or changed it?
Yeah, you do have to be very aware of it. And this is what true crime does, that when I wrote my book on the Salvation Army abuse at Basil the Boys' Home, I had so many people write to me and say, my uncle was in that home. Now I get why he is like he is. When you skate a bit close to particular cases, you're telling the story of many. I had a woman say to me at one of my author talks, she said, a friend of mine in Melbourne just got her drink spiked last week, and she's a woman in her 50s. And luckily, her friends were there. So I think the drink spiking, certainly we've had some big cases like that. We've had plenty of examples of really predatory behaviour. So I wanted to really address that. I wanted to address that this is an ongoing problem, and it's still a problem, not perhaps with the drug that I used in the book because it has been outlawed, but there's plenty of drugs out there that are still being used, and you can always get them.
I think because you've created this gung-ho Antigone Pollard, who is aware of the psychology of victims and is this strong woman, so her response to victims and her support for victims, it was so well considered. It was all the right steps, and it was
gentle. It was gentle,
yeah.
And there was no blaming. And she jumped on anyone that even thinks of, well, she shouldn't have gone out, or if I would tell, or whatever. She jumps on that, and she's like, no, you wouldn't. Like, you can't. Don't blame the victim. Put the blame back where it belongs.
Yeah, unapologetic. I did appreciate the way you did it, in stark contrast to the overbearing supervisor who really just didn't want a bar of it, which we've all seen these characters, let's face it.
We've seen so many characters like that. And funnily enough, a friend of mine who's retired from the police now, but she said, oh my God, your senior sergeant was like every senior sergeant I ever met. And I thought that was really funny because I hadn't actually based him on a senior sergeant. I'd based him on several, bosses that I've experienced. So it wasn't even within the police system, but it was interesting that these kind of characters are everywhere and they resonate. But I think Antigone knows too that behaviour that is unchecked escalates. And this is a theme. It's a theme in true crime, and it's a theme that I think subtly runs through this, that if she doesn't say to her boss, you know what, you can't talk to me like that, or I'm just going to walk out of the room if you're behaving inappropriately. If she doesn't take a stand, he's going to get worse. And when we ignore and don't believe women who report sexual assault or whatever, it doesn't go away. It escalates because it gives the perpetrator, it's almost giving them permission. Well, you can do this with immunity. Nothing will happen. There'll be no consequences. So I think what she's always doing, and a lot of women have to do this, is always just saying, I can't let this go. I can't not comment, I can't not confront this because it will get worse.
So often the detective has a dark past, abuses alcohol, or has something going on that makes them edgy, I guess. It was nice to have someone who pours cups of tea, doesn't mind cooking something nice, and just is genuinely a centered person.
And I felt like I really wanted her to read, so she reads books. I think that's really important. I wanted her to be taking over from her nan when she says, I'm going to make your tea cake. And I think this helplessness in some characters of, oh, I can't possibly cook. My nan always used to say, if you can read, you can cook, because there's a recipe. It's not hard. And to have these cups of teas and to have these quiet moments of reflection. And I just think that women have to be self-sufficient. And she's not making a cake for anyone else. She's making the cake for her nan and her female lunch companion. Now that I think about it, there's quite a few cakes in this book. There's a lot of cake making. I think that's really nice. And that's very much CWA, I think.
Now, Vikki, I don't know if I'm meant to get an impression, but I got an impression there might be more to this. Are you writing another fiction, and will it follow on with Antigone?
Yeah, once the book is finished, I always start straight away because I can't ever have a gap. I see writers on Twitter saying, I don't know what I'm going to do for the next 6 months while I'm shopping my book. And I'm like, write another one. So the minute it was finished, I had started writing the sequel back then. I just one day I got an idea and I started writing. So when the book did come out, I've had so many reviews are saying, we want more Wazza, we want more Antigone, we want more Waffles. And I thought, well, yeah, I need to keep these characters going. And, they're already well off on their next adventure.
Oh, I'm so excited. I didn't even barely touch on Wazza. He was a really good fella, and Waffles, I just, I've got a dog. I got so much love for Waffles.
I wrote a book on the dog squad called The Dog Squad, and I spent 6 months out at the police dog squad interviewing dog handlers. So, all of Waffles comes from me interviewing handlers, telling me about these quirky, funny dogs, and Waffles certainly comes back in the next one.
Vikki Petraitis there, speaking with me about The Unbelieved, and you can pick that up just about everywhere at the moment, but if you're looking for it online, it's published by Allen and Unwin.
And now to comfort reads, if murder and mystery is your idea of chilling out, that is. Here's Tsundoku's own Cath Keneally and bookshop owner Sarah Tooth sharing their obsession with Agatha Christie.
Sarah, I know that you and I share a passion of long-standing, and we're talking about a woman who was born at the end of the 19th century, started writing maybe about 100 years ago. I still have a rotating collection of hers by the bed, and if I need to calm down before I go to sleep, I pick up an Agatha Christie, and it almost doesn't matter which one.
Couldn't have described it better myself. If you need to calm down, I turn to my darling Agatha Christie, and I have done, I think, since I was about, like a lot of people, had their first exposure at about 12. We didn't have young adult books back then, so we had to read things like Agatha Christie. I can still remember, I have a terrible memory, and I can remember, and then there were none, picking it up, reading it. I could not believe that a book could do that. I couldn't believe that anything could do that, that could be anything that existed in the world, that you could write this thing of such mystery and so impossible to believe or untangle, that worked so perfectly. And that was my introduction to Agatha.
And here we still are, and still devouring her, and over again. What is it when I try and pin it down? These days, the thing I'm loving the most are her beginnings. I love how she sets out a story.
Yeah, those setups are glorious, aren't they? One I love is the Caribbean mystery, and she meets she's sitting down with all these sort of the cast of eccentric characters start to sort of, drop into the picture, and you're so excited because you know that one of them is going to not be alive, and one of them's going to have done it, and it's just so that glorious anticipation.
And they're called cozies, but they're not extremely cozy in the sense that awful things happen, and in some books you get quite upset by the things that happen. A Murder is Announced is one of my absolute favourites that I go back to. And when poor old, is it Hinch? The not designated as such, but the obvious lesbian couple, one of whom gets killed because she spotted something, and that breaks me up every time.
I know, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? And you feel the sort of there's those moments where it cracks through into humanity, where it's not just an unfolding mystery. And there are so many stories of tragedy and darkness and suspicions, and also just those terrible sort of historical things that have embedded themselves in people that they can't quite ever recover from. And these are things that, you know, are still so very much part of cultural television, films, books that people are still writing and devouring now. And I think that's what's interesting, is that they are these exquisite mysteries, but they also are they're a sharp eye on humanity and the world that she was living in.
I'm really interested, when I go back to Agatha, to go back to the very earliest ones and just note how on the ball she is, and she continues to be so. She keeps up with every era as it approaches and breaks upon her, and she's always very good with the social mores. But some of the very earliest ones seem strangely modern.
Look, don't they? All her themes and her ideas, they seem to just come out fully formed in the 20s, don't they? Like Styles is the first one. It's got everything. It's got the closed circle of people. Does it have a map, a floor plan? I think it might. I love that. You know, and it's got, of course, the famous reveal, you know, when they pull everyone together at the end and do the reveal. And these are all things that stayed till her last book was published in 1976, when she goes back to Styles, doesn't she, with Poirot and Curtin. Again, very, very sad book, and a very nasty crime, and a very, very dark, but it makes me feel so good when I read it. It's inexplicable how happy they make me.
Are you more of a Marple fan or a Poirot fan?
I'm all Marple. I'm 100% team Marple. Always very sad that there aren't more Marple books. I think she's exquisite. I love every form of her. I love every book about her. I've got these lovely books that are like The Life of Jane Marple, where people have written biography. You know, they've pieced together biographies of her and stuff, because Agatha notoriously did not write backstory. She gets, people complain about, well, these aren't proper characters, even Poirot and Marple, because we don't really know, but we know exactly what we need to know about them, don't we? Yeah, so my heart is and always will be with Jane Marple.
Me too. I love you, Jane. And I think if I have to choose a favourite, it would be 450 from Paddington.
I'm just so in love with Murder at the Vicarage. I read it young. I read it early. Yes, it does have a map. So, I'm obviously going to adore that one. And it's St Mary Mead, and I'm just so excited to have it. It's just so great to go back there, and I can't remember which sort of maid she has, because she always has a girl in from the local orphanage, and they often are having adventures, aren't they, in her books, getting mixed up in all sorts of things. And she's probably knitting and just talking and being a busybody, or a sharp investigative eye, whichever way you look at it. Yeah, I do love that one. And
I love At Bertram's Hotel.
I haven't read that for so long, actually. Yeah, it is unique, and I should go back to it. But I read A Caribbean Mystery, read it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've read it. And I went on to, I have an enduring obsession with tropical islands. I studied Indonesian. I lived in Bali, and I can trace it all back to my very early formative experiences with the way Agatha Christie made me feel.
How do we feel finally about her Middle Eastern stories? She, of course, was married to an archaeologist, Max Mallowan, highly decorated, and she followed him around on his travels. She knew whereof she spoke, and I've just reread They Came to Baghdad and thought, you know what? she's actually nailed it.
She's absolutely nailed it. Yeah, we didn't talk about those. I mean, and obviously Death on the Nile, Murder on the Orient Express, from this time when she was really grieving the loss of her mother and her marriage. But, you know, she was indomitable in that classic earlier 20th century woman way, and had the money as well, you know, to be able to go out and do it without being so upper class that she had those sort of restrictions. She came from essentially the perfect class, you know, upper middle back then, for freedom, for peak freedom. And those books are incredible. And the ones of when she actually gets to Syria, Iraq, Mesopotamia, all these places, like we could be any more obsessed with those places when you're young. And yeah, and the books are incredible. They're so evocative. And even this one, I'm wearing a T-shirt as we speak, which is Death Comes as the End, which is her historical novel. It's set in ancient Egypt. So she actually has a novel that's even, because she has her non-Poirot, non-Marple books, of which I am also a fan. I've even got Agatha Christie's poems, that book. Have you got that?
No, I have not.
Well, I can tell you, she is possibly the worst poet that ever existed, and I treasure that book so much. You've never seen so many exclamation marks in poetry. It's incredible. Capital letters in the end of every second line, and exclamation point. She never mastered the art of poetry.
Let's finish then on a slightly more cautious note, because Agatha was a product of her time. Some of her attitudes are, well, not attitudes that we would still get behind by any means. And, you know, it's not always a character who voices the attitudes. It's sort of, there'll be attitudes apparent in her descriptions of people, often sort of little rather yellow-looking people who are Jewish and things like that. You know, they're there, that is there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially the anti-Semitism, and obviously there is a lot of racism and racial stereotyping going on in the novel. Some editions had to be withdrawn and reissued under different names because of the deeply offensive language. And of course, it's not enough to say, oh, she was a product of her time, because what you learn when you read through an archive of, you know, historical literature is that there was always people saying, this is not right, these are not right ways to represent people when you have the power of the pen. I am very aware of all of those problems, and I don't wish to find any excuses for them or to endorse them, and I totally understand people who reject her and her novels on that basis, and I believe I usually would, but I cannot let her go. She's so deep in me, and I don't read the ones that I feel upset me. And I think that's why Murder is Announced is so beautiful, because the novels that have queer characters in them do feel so real for the time, you know, don't they? They just feel exactly like it was. So there's no easy answer to those questions, is there? Yeah, except for just acknowledging and being aware that it's not the same for everyone, their reading experiences.
Cath Keneally and Sarah Tooth bonding over Agatha Christie. Sarah runs a bookshop specialising in second-hand books by 20th century women, and we'll be doing a tour of that bookshop in an upcoming episode.
You're listening to Tsundoku, the podcast of people for whom books are an indispensable part of life.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm in my mid-30s. I think my first memories were a lot of the Alison Lester books, like Imagine, and the really beautiful visual stories of kids playing at the beach. My parents read me a lot of Aboriginal folk tales and stuff, deeply spiritual and connected to country, stories of landscapes and mythical beasts and creatures, and how the moon came up into the sky and how the mountains were formed. Some of my favourite books have been some Graham Hancock books, like Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods. So that's like a really nice take on human history and a bit of a flip on how we see our considered reality of how the last 10, 15,000 years happened in human history. Some of my all-time favourite books that I've read when I was discovering the world and myself and stuff would have been The Alchemist which is just a very great short tale that is just like timeless and for any generation, any person. Siddhartha is another one. It's a really beautiful book kind of about Buddhism, but in like a really classic kind of folk tale, so it's really digestible. And I think for a young male at that point in time, it's a really nice way to digest the world and philosophy and the human spirit. And another one I've loved is The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. You know, it's like a mini Bible or something, like a way to kind of traverse your path through life. You know, those nice and easily digestible deep wisdom stuff. And in the field of fiction, some of my favourite books of all time have been The Circle, which has just been the most beautiful sci-fi because it's almost like reading a science fiction, but it's only a couple of years into the future, which it's really nice to imagine like a world that's not that far away and you can kind of see it all unfolding. Two of my other favourites have been Cloud Atlas and The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. Sitting in my Tsundoku for many, many years, and sometimes, you know, flapping in the wind of the fan, is Plato's Republic, which is really hard to read. And every time, sometimes I'll just be like, oh, I should get back into that, and I'll chip through a page or two, but I just fall asleep instantly because it's amazing and it's rich, and it's a really famous book, but it is quite hard to not fall asleep to. And I think it'll be in my Tsundoku forever.
And remember, if you'd like to share your reading history and reading habits, do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. You can record yourself using what you just heard as a guide, 3 to 4 minutes, and send us an MP3 to tsundokucast@gmail.com. Time for us to go. Hope you've also been catching our mini-sodes. There's another one coming up shortly. I'm Annie Hastwell. Goodbye from Tsundoku.
And I'm Sarah Martin. Happy reading. Talk soon. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Cath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev,
Annie Hastwell,
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Tsundokucast, TSUNDOKU cast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.